Mr. Brzezinski, let me ask this question. Let me have, starting with Ms. Flournoy, let me have each of you answer this. NATO has been called the most successful political military alliance in history, yet as we've all mentioned, some critics have claimed that NATO is obsolete or that the U.S. shares too large a burden within the alliance. The architects of the alliance, Truman, Acheson, Marshall, and Eisenhower, would be incredulous to learn that their creation, NATO, and the lasting Atlantic Partnership is now in question. Let me ask each of you, in your previous positions, would you have been able to execute our foreign policy and national security objectives without the support and contributions from our allies in NATO? Ms. Flournoy, let's start with you.
No, the short answer is no. NATO was a critical partner in enabling us to surge forces in Afghanistan. They were a critical partner in bolstering deterrence in Europe in the face of a more assertive and aggressive Russia. And NATO members individually have been critical partners in other operations like counterterrorism the world over. So NATO, in my experience, remained absolutely critical. It's the first place we would turn to for partners to accomplish shared objectives.
Thank you, Mr. Cholet.
Mr. Chairman, I completely agree with that. In my capacity at the Pentagon, serving for the Secretary of Defense, 3 times a year we would travel to NATO headquarters in Brussels to meet with his Minister of Defense counterparts. Secretary of State has their own meetings with their counterparts, and this became a way for us to coordinate, to plan, and to talk about crisis response and also issues over the horizon. NATO was absolutely our partner of first resort, and much of what we have been able to accomplish in Europe and elsewhere is unimaginable without having such a strong, enduring alliance.
Mr. Lute.
Mr. Chairman, I can only agree. I would argue further that, as Ms. Flournoy mentioned in her opening comments, if we didn't have NATO today, when we confronted the kind of challenges that the panel has outlined, we would actually be racing to discover NATO and to invent NATO. So it is, in fact, indispensable.
Thank you, Mr. Brzezinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I concur with my colleagues. We would not have been able to execute what we have done in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and the Balkans without our NATO allies. Sitting in the Pentagon, I saw firsthand how absolutely invaluable it is to have other countries whose militaries are not only fully interoperable, but have deep personal relationships among their commanders, among their NCOs. That is the reason why, when we have a contingency that requires multinational support, we turn to our NATO allies first. NATO is indispensable to U.S. security and too often to U.S. military operations beyond our border.
Thank you. Mr. Brzezinski, let me just stay with you and mention something, expand on something that you mentioned. I could not agree with you more when you spoke about NATO enlargement. I think NATO, frankly, missed the boat back in 2008 when they did not expand to include Ukraine and Georgia. I think that gave Putin the idea that he could do whatever he wanted and that we would not stand up to him, including all his things in Crimea and all his other belligerent manners. So I don't know if you want to expand on that. I just wanted to say that I agree with your comments.
Thank you, sir. You know, when we look at the Black Sea region, that is a zone of increasing confrontation with Russia. I do agree with you that if we had provided Ukraine and Georgia a more robust commitment to their transatlantic aspirations, it's less likely that Putin would have made his move against Georgia, and it's even less likely that he would have made his move against Ukraine. Putin thrives on weakness, and he exploits hesitancy and uncertainty. And unfortunately, the West's posture towards these two countries has created a de facto gray zone in European security. And that just whets the appetite of someone like Putin. If he sees an opportunity or senses there's not a lack of commitment to support another country along its border in their former Soviet space, he sees that as an opportunity to reanimate the hegemony that Moscow exerted during the Cold War. That's what he's about, and unfortunately, that is the position that we have put these countries in. And it's sad, because these countries seek NATO membership, and more often than not, they've actually sent troops to support our operations in the Balkans and in Afghanistan. I remember the dramatic footage of a Georgian platoon fighting in Afghanistan, defending our embassy, and doing a really good job of it. They need more support than we're providing them.
Thank you. Ms. Flournoy, let me ask you this. What would be the consequences of pulling our troops home or reducing the size of the U.S. presence in Europe? How would it impact our ability to project power globally, and could an ad hoc coalition take the place of our NATO basing and alliance network? If not, why not?
As we saw during the surge in Afghanistan and our combat mission there, our basing in Europe was absolutely critical as a hub for our rotational forces going in and out of that conflict. In addition, the fact that we'd been in Europe working with our allies in exercises and training and constantly working on interoperability, we experienced the benefits of that when we had to deploy together, whether it was in the Balkans or Afghanistan or elsewhere. So that basing has been a critical hub. Now that there's a returned threat to Europe itself with Russia's behavior, that those bases become absolutely critical as both a symbol of the U.S. commitment and resolve to defend Europe and our interests there, but also, a caution, a blinking yellow light to Vladimir Putin to say, if you come into NATO, across NATO's borders, you are immediately declaring war not only with Europe, but with the United States. So I think it's very important to maintain and strengthen. There are things I would do to strengthen that infrastructure in Europe, but I think it's very important to maintain it as a starting point. Thank you.
A few of you have mentioned China as a country that we need to be looking at very carefully for its aggressiveness and what it might do in the future. Wondering if any of you would, Mr. Cholet or Mr. Lute, would you want to comment on that? I forget which one of you mentioned it.
Well, I can take a first crack. I think China is something that NATO members need to begin to engage more seriously. I think there is more talk in Europe about looking at China as a security threat. Of course, there's been a lot of news recently about disputes between the United States and some European partners on China's investment, particularly in the technology space within Europe. But we're seeing China invest in infrastructure in Europe, ports, critical technologies, engaging more in the high north, and China engaging much more with Russia. Last year, there was a very large exercise in the Far East called Vostok 18 that involved hundreds of thousands of Russian troops, thousands of Chinese troops. And this is something that got a lot of attention by our military commanders in Europe and in Asia. It's evidence of greater cooperation between Russia and China, cooperation that our intelligence community has testified publicly before Congress is something they're watching. So although there are many aspects to the China challenge, and the security piece is just one, I think this is something that I see NATO engaging much more deeply in the coming 5 to 10 years. And I think that there's a willingness in Europe to do so.
Okay, so, Mr. Chairman, I'm not so concerned about China's military impact on Europe. What I am concerned about, as Derek Cholet mentioned, China's increasing commercial influence. It's buying its way into transportation infrastructure, IT, communications infrastructure, and so forth. We've seen early signs that those commercial investments are leading to political influence. They expect a political return on their commercial investment. And even more, I think, strategically important, over the next 2 to 3 decades, it's clear that the U.S.-Chinese competition will be at the forefront of world politics. And we should ask ourselves as Americans, do we wish to compete with China alone, or would we favor an arrangement where we have 29 like-minded allies on our side as we enter into this geostrategic competition that's going to define the rest of our lives? I would clearly prefer to go in with a NATO team.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me say